Hello, welcome to Only for Your Ears, and today's episode 9, The Wild Swans, which I've renamed as A Stepmother's Wicked Spell Turns into a Reversal of Fortune. The structure is going to be the same as usual, starting off with a summary that highlights the most important points of the story. Then my critical review on how this story plays in society today. And then, lastly but not least, the trigger points, which I found running through the story. Let's begin. A stepmother's wicked spell turns into a reversal of fortune. There was a widowed king living with his 12 children in a faraway kingdom. He had 11 princes and one princess. I digress straight away, people. Who raised these children? I can't believe the king did this. However, one day he decides to remarry, but marries a wicked queen who turns out to be a witch. I digress again. The king obviously didn't look into who he was marrying. He just wanted someone to love him and not necessarily his children. And out of spite, the queen turns her stepsons into magnificent swans who are allowed to temporarily become human only at night and force them to fly by day. When their sister reaches the age of 15, the queen tries to bewitch her. Eliza's goodness is too strong for this, so the queen has her banished from making after making her unrecognizable by dirtying her face and ripping her dress. I digress again. The wicked queen witch feels threatened that she cannot corrupt Eliza's pure soul through manipulation. Eliza finds her brothers who carry Eliza to safety in a foreign land where she is out of reach of her evil stepmother, I'd say. There, Eliza is guided by the queen of the fairies to gather stinging nettles in graveyards to knit into shirts that will eventually help her brothers regain their human shape. I digress. Eliza was put into good hands by her loyal brothers. Eliza endures painfully blistered hands from the nettle stings, and she must also take a vow of silence for the duration of the task, for speaking one word would kill her brothers. I digress. Again, Eliza has to complete a good task to free her brothers from her evil stepmother's spell. The handsome prince from faraway land happens to come across Eliza, who cannot talk and falls in love with her. I digress. It's amazing how a pure and innocent soul can transmit even from afar. He grants her a room in his castle where she continues her knitting. Eventually, he proposes to crown her as his queen and wife, and she accepts. However, the archbishop is chagrined because he thinks Eliza is a witch. He wishes she were a witch. But the king will not believe him. I digress. This sounds like a judgmental person who wants to push his ideas and influence on the king and wants to simply believe what he wants to believe just because it suits him. One night, Eliza runs out of the nettle and is forced to collect more in the nearby church graveyard where the archbishop is watching. Ghoulish spirits that devour the bodies of the dead are also in the churchyard, and the archbishop believes that Eliza is in league with them. I digress again, people. This is typical when someone wants to believe what they want to believe because it suits them. He reports the incident to the king as proof of witchcraft. His own evil mind. I digress. I bet The amount of witchcraft that has been discussed in some religious circles, I can't believe it. Does this mean the church such hasn't con- has conducted such acts? No. But anything that's not in step with God can then be considered witchcraft, would be seen as negative. The statues of the saints shake their heads in protest, but the archbishop misinterprets this sign as confirmation of Eliza's guilt. The archbishop orders Eliza put on trial for witchcraft. I digress again. Taking advantage and projecting blame while the guilty wash their hands. She can speak no word in her defense and is sentenced to death by burning at the stake. The brothers discover Eliza and tries to speak to the king but fail, thwarted by the rising sun. Even as the term brill bear, Eliza goes away to execution. She continues knitting, determined to continue up to the last moment of her life. I digress. While her life is slipping away, Eliza still shows her family loyalty until the end. This enrages the people who are on the brink of snatching and ripping the shirts into pieces when the swans descend and rescue Eliza. A good turn. I digress. Finally, the community take a sign from the universe instead of blindly following gossiping people. The people interpret this as a sign from heaven that Eliza throws the shirts over the swans. Her brothers return to their human forms. The youngest brother has swan arm instead of an arm, as Eliza did not have the time to finish one sleeve of his shirt. Eliza is now free to speak and tell the truth, but faints from exhaustion. So her brothers explain. I digress. Eliza's brothers show steadfast solidarity of loyalty towards their sister, as do the firewood around Eliza's stake miraculously takes root and turns into flowers. The king plucks the topmost flower and places it on Eliza's chest. She is revived by the white flower, and King Eliza are married. And I digress. The family spell has been reversed, and the king's offspring form a true family bond away from their wicked stepmother. This is really, really good. A reversal of fortune, I called it. And now let's take a look at the critical review on how it plays in society or in today's society. You know, what a wonderful story about loyalty, family, unity, and discovering love through painful separation. I believe this story illustrates a sense of togetherness through the evil doings of a wicked stepmother and a negligent king who was powerless to protect his own children from harm's way. The king's 11 sons and only daughter shows the universe they could parent themselves as a family unit. It's far better than the king was ever possible. Let's take a look at some of the sentences I've chosen to frame my review. There was a widowed king living with his 12 children in a faraway kingdom. He has 11 princes and one princess. I digress. Who raised these children? I can't believe this king did this. However, one day he decides to remarry, but marries a wicked queen who turns out to be a witch. I digress again. The king obviously didn't look into who he was marrying. He just wanted someone to love and not necessarily his children. This reminds me of the film The Sound of Music. A lonely, successful naval officer living in Switzerland with his six children, whom he didn't need to look after because his wife took care of the family maternal and nurturing needs. When the mother dies, he's left flat-footed, as I call it. He doesn't know what to do except hire a slew of inappropriate governesses until Julie Andrews' character enters the house and completely turns into the perfect friend, teacher, nurturer, and mother. But the father doesn't quite recognize this until he decides to introduce his girlfriend to his children, where all her lack of maternal skills start to rear its ugly head. This woman has she's just like the wicked stepmother in this true story, but she doesn't cast an evil spell, of course. A party takes place, and the naval officer invites the nanny, and they share a brief dance. This is where their feelings come to the surface. And because Julie Andrews' character, played by Maria, is training to be a nun, she runs away from the house. Well, this is after she was confronted. She's confronted by the girlfriend who's jealous and can see the natural chemistry developing. The children absolutely love her, and the naval officer is beginning to have feelings for her. Therefore, she realizes that she will be no good if Julie Andrews' character stays around. Anyway, what happens is the children are completely upset with his girlfriend, and they go and visit Maria, who's in the convent, and she refuses to come out and see anybody. The nuns gather around her and speak, or one of them does, and says, you have to face your responsibility. If you love this man, you have to go back. If you love these children, you have to go back to the house. Well, she does come back to the house, and they express their love for each other, and they get married in this glorious fantasy ceremony. It's wonderful. But she turns out to be so perfect, because not only does she have the love of the naval officer and vice versa, but the children really love her, and she really loves them. And they consider her a friend and a mother, everything all in one. It's such a beautiful story of how, one example of somebody that's completely inappropriate, like the queen, wicked queen in this story, wasn't interested in the children at all. She wanted to have the power. And there's nothing worse, when you marry someone and you have to look after their children. She doesn't want to have to look after their children. She doesn't even want the memory of a previous marriage. And so she felt very threatened. And in these situations, getting remarried again and having a stepmother or a stepfather can cause a lot of problems. But in this case, in The Sound of Music, it turned out to be a blessing, a big, big blessing. Next one, number 2. However, one day he decides to remarry, but marries a wicked queen who turns out to be a witch. I digress. The queen obviously didn't look into who he was marrying. He just wanted someone to love him and not necessarily his children. And out of spite, the queen turns her stepsons into magnificent swans who are allowed to temporarily become human only at night out of her sight and forced to fly by day. When their sister reaches the age of 15, the queen tries to bewitch her. Eliza's goodness is too strong for this, so the queen has her banished after making her unrecognizable by dirtying her face and ripping her clothes. Again, this is typical of the threatened, wicked stepmother. Most unfortunate. This is a typical case of stepmother's insecurities coming to the surface. There's a strong need to rid oneself of the remnants of the king's past marriage, and that includes discarding his children. She's casting a spell on 11 sons, forcing them to fly away from the only true family they know. However, she feels she can manipulate Eliza, which is a big mistake because she doesn't realize, because she doesn't know Eliza, how pure Eliza is. This reminds me of the stories I heard about my stepfather, my grand stepfather, who terrified my deceased mother. When he married my grandmother, my mother's mother, she had 3 children and a set of twins, which were 3 years older than my mother. The story from my mother is that her stepfather really didn't like her. This is a big problem if the step parent doesn't like all the children or favors 2 instead of all of the children. Stepfather really didn't like her, and he would tell my grandmother not to not to buy my mother any clothes, not to buy her any clothes, not to buy her anything. He did not like my mother, but he liked her brother and sister, which were twins. That's why she literally saved and looked after her clothing until the last month that she died. She was obsessed with buying clothes and making sure that she looked after them as though they were perfectly brand new. And it really has a lot to do with the fact that my grand stepfather was not a particularly nice and caring person, and he did not love her. She felt unloved and insecure. This is only natural, which I know is a terrible feeling to have. In theory, we are all taught that our examples of love, care, and valuing ourselves until comes from our parents. They set the example, they set the tone until we develop into more independent beings. However, for a large group of people, and I'm realizing this more and more in society as I'm going through my own healing, a large group of people didn't have this type of example. When my father was having his affair with a woman who became my stepmother, she didn't want my father to have a relationship with his children from his first marriage. In a lot of circumstances, they see this as a threat. And furthermore, she had a daughter who I'm sure wanted my dad to give her all the attention, which he actually did. He gave her all the attention. In actual fact, he went as far as to annul the marriage. That meant that not only did his first marriage not exist, he was basically saying that his 2 children from that first marriage didn't exist. And especially me, because I was the youngest child, that my mother used to manipulate to keep my dad in a marriage that he did not want to be in. And he treated us like we weren't important to him. The third sentence. However, the Archbishop is chagrined because he thinks Eliza is a witch, but the king will not believe him. I digress. This sounds like a judgmental person who wants to push his ideas and influence on the king. One night, Eliza runs out of the nettle and is forced to collect more in the nearby church graveyard where the Archbishop is watching. Ghoulish spirits that devour the bodies of the dead are also in the church, and the Archbishop believes that Eliza is in league with them. This is a person that just wants to believe what he wants to believe. This rings awfully true. The feeling someone deliberately wants to believe that you're an evil in some way or think the worst of you because they feel threatened by you. And in some respects, it's an abuse of power. This reminds me of the true story of the film The Hurricane, Hurricane Carter, a very successful black boxer during the civil rights movement, was accused of murdering a small group of white people in an all-white restaurant. He was never there and he didn't murder these people, but the court case was rigged and Hurricane was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. However, the story changes when three Canadians and a young black boy they're fostering is captivated by the book, The Hurricane, that he finds in the library. So the boy starts to develop a friendship with Hurricane in prison. He writes a little letter. He says he'd love to meet him. After several weeks and maybe a couple of months, they finally arrange to meet each other in the prison. And after he meets him, he's even more convinced that this that Hurricane is innocent, that he did not commit this crime. Well, anyway, the three Canadians get together, get connected with a really good lawyer, and go over the case step by step by step. Finally, the case is brought to the court again. This is after he spent 28 years in prison. They go on trial again and they realize that the person that accused Hurricane of murdering these people is the High Chief Police Commissioner. He never saw Hurricane murder him. He didn't care. What he wanted was to put this good black boxer away in prison because he was threatened by him, just like the Archbishop and the Wicked Witch and the Queen were threatened by Eliza's good, pure nature. That was an abuse of power. And of course, the police officer showed his abuse of power. And so they find out that the police officer was against Hurricane and that he rigged and messed with all the evidence to point it towards him. In fact, they never found out who murdered these people, but all they know is that Hurricane was going to be free and that the case was dismissed because he never did it. But it's just typical. When somebody is against you and they feel threatened by you, they will say everything and anything to turn people against you, and like a poison pill. So you can be discriminated against. And if you're black and it's a case of a murder, be thrown in prison for the rest of your life. Highly discriminatory. Let's go to the trigger points. Well, the trigger points, as I've explained in so many episodes now, it's really about a situation that reminds you of something that you did in the past and a past habit, a past abuse, and a situation in the present drags you back, and it can do, in a lot of cases it does, it drags you back to believing that you have not changed or you haven't healed, which is not true. Some people go back to old habits and then realize as they're going downhill that they were triggered, and other people are able to interrupt it before they digress into the bad habits. So the trigger points that came up for me during this story was the part where it says the king obviously didn't look into who he was marrying. He just wanted someone to love him and not necessarily his children. My dad and my stepmother. This reminds me of their situation. Now, I'm not saying that my dad did not love my stepmother. He obviously did, but she was also a fantastic distraction away from the the obvious situation with my mother, who he did not love. He did not love. And so she was a great distraction. And also, she had a child. So he basically, when he married this woman, he had a ready made family. Now, my father went to drastic lengths, also with my stepmother, uh, using a spell, just like the Wicked Witch and the Queen did, using a spell, using obia as a way to really hurt my mother mentally and emotionally. She was already compromised because was an undiagnosed narcissist, but with the obia, with the spells that my dad was casting on her and also on the family, but more so her, he wanted to prove that she was psychologically so imbalanced that that the Catholic Church would grant him a divorce. And that was the only way that they would grant him a divorce. And so he was able to get the divorce under the circumstances that she was an unfit or psychologically unwell person. And so they granted him the divorce, which he got a couple of years later. But it was 7 years of separation, and then they finally got the divorce. But even so, and when they did get a divorce, it wasn't just a divorce, it was an annulment to say, you don't exist, this marriage never existed, and the children never existed. Can you imagine? The children never really existed. So basically, he was just saying to me, you don't exist. I don't care about you. I don't care about your sister, who he used horrendously. And I certainly don't care about you. And it was this horrible, horrible feeling. So during this story, when at the very beginning, when you hear that the king remarries somebody, he doesn't care whether she loves the children or not. They are irrelevant to him. All he wants is somebody to love him, to take care of him. And he's too weak and feeble minded as a person to stand up and to protect himself and also protect his own children. He does not care. The incompetency. And, I almost felt the same way about my dad. I do not mind the fact that he divorced my mother. Good for him. She needed to, he needed to be rid of her. Good for him. But she was also a broken person. And I don't blame him wanting to be rid of her. But what I do blame him for, his irresponsibility towards his children. He just didn't care about us. So this feeling that he didn't care about us, it really triggered me. And it triggered me for a long time. I felt as though nobody loved me. Nobody loved me at all. But I was reminded when I saw this story and worked through this story that my mother got married to a wonderful man who turned out to be my incredible stepfather, who loved us, who loved my sister, he loved me, and he made us feel incredibly, incredibly welcome. And so the feelings of negativity that came up during this story were able to remind me of, but your mother was so fortunate. She married an incredible man. So I didn't feel that real sensation of worthlessness as I've always felt during my life, for the most part. That was the first trigger, and I didn't fall for it. I did not fall for it this time. The second trigger, there Eliza is guided by the queen of the fairies to gather stinging nettles in graveyards to knit into shirts that will eventually help her brothers regain their human shape. I digress. Eliza was put into good hands by her loyal brothers. Yes, this reminds me, the wonderful fairy, the good fairy, reminds me of my stepfather, John, who passed away in 2016. He was a really, really good, decent man. And I can honestly say he was too good for my mother, too. He was orphaned. His mother, he never knew his mother. He absolutely never knew his mother. He was raised by his grandmother. Didn't know his mother, didn't know his father. He was an incredible craftsman, a draftsman, I should say, a draftsman, and he worked for the British press. He was from Grenada. No, not Grenada. It was Dominican Republican. He was from the Dominican Republic, and he was incredibly proud of being a draftsman and working for the British press. When he started pursuing my mother and dating her, he always, always made my sister and I feel so welcome. And it's because he came from this background of just being abandoned by his mother. He didn't know his mother, he didn't know his father. So he always went out of his way, just like, in a way, the fairy, the queen of the fairies, always made you feel welcome, always made you feel a part of the family. He admired good work, he admired study, and he admired good education. But he was always there for us. And he was married before. He had his wife had 2 children with another partner. And again, he made them all feel welcome. He was just a really good, decent man. And when he passed away, I realized, the idea that I never really had a father was not true. I never had a real relationship, a good relationship with my first father. But I had an incredible relationship with my stepfather, John, who up to this day I'm enormously grateful for. So that was the second trigger. And those feelings of unworthiness and having such a wonderful example of such goodness from this man really healed me. The last trigger is, I digress. While her life is slipping away, Eliza still shows her family loyalty until the end. This enrages the people who are on the brink of snatching and ripping the shirts into pieces when the swans descend and rescue Eliza. Finally, the sense of being rescued, the sense of being supported, the sense of unity, that you're a part of us, you're a part of this family. You're not separate. We're here for you the same way that you are here for me. Now, this was really impacting for me because I come from a family that is still dysfunctional. My blood family is still dysfunctional, and even parts of my step family they're very divisive. And I've never felt as though I was supported or loved or really actually cared for, as though I was really part of the family. John was the only one that sort of made me feel as though I was part of the family now, as much as he could, because I lived abroad. I've lived abroad since 1982, and I hardly ever went back to England. But when I did, it was great. And we spoke to each other all the time on the phone when I was living in Spain for the 22 years. It was wonderful. But the sensation of having people around you, I've got your back. I've really got your back. And the other day I wrote a poem, and it was called Are You Willing? And it's part of my journey of healing. Are you willing? And this poem was really about my commitment to my inner child for so long, because I was treated poorly and my feelings were dismissed. I was treated like the outsider. I wasn't important. I never had that real sense of support. I treated my inner child like, you're just a Raggedy Ann. I just tossed you to the side. I started realizing that all this time when I felt as though I had no one that really supported and cared for me, I realized through writing this poem, and this little girl, this inner girl, says, come on, we can go the distance. We can heal together. We're almost there. I've got your back. And it's really interesting. I never thought of that before, that this inner child that I treated the way that other people had treated me was still there for me. And it's like, I've got your back. Just like her brothers, we've got your back, Eliza. You are loyal to us, and we're going to be loyal to you. Now, I don't think I was really loyal to my inner child, but my inner child steadfastly waited for me to wake up and realize the only person, apart from my stepdad, but the only person deep down from the very, very beginning, when all the trauma and all the pain started, she's gone the distance with me, was the only person that had my back. And I'm forever grateful to her. And now I'm going the distance with her to experience what it's like to heal and to be whole. Thank you very much. That was the third trigger. The realization that I'm not alone and that she never abandoned me the way I abandoned her, and she was always there for me. Well, this is the end of today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it was informative for you. So I'm going to leave with my typical phrase is that healing is a lifelong gift we give ourselves, mind, body, and soul. Healing is a lifelong gift we give ourselves, mind, body, and soul. Please feel free to give it a good thumbs up if you liked the episode. It helps with the algorithms. And also subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything, just a press of the button, and that's it. So take care. Look forward to seeing you next week. Bye.